Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the next instalment of my read-along discussion. If you're not aware, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style read-along of Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, so we're reading a few chapters a month in the parts that the Victorians would have originally read it in. So this is the third month of the read-along, and this month we read chapters 8, 9 and 10. I will link down below the Goodreads group for the read-along and also the two previous videos I have done on previous chapters. So today I'm going to talk about chapters 8, 9 and 10. So we were reading 3 chapters of Our Mutual Friend this month. We read chapter 8, Mr. Boffin and Consultation, chapter 9, Mr. and Mrs. Boffin and Consultation, and chapter 10, A Marriage Contract, which is a chapter I'm very, very fond of. In fact, all 3 of these chapters I am very fond of. I think this is a very, very nice little set. So as I've done before, I'm going to go through July's chapters. I'm going to do a quick overview of the plot of these chapters and then talk about some things within them which I feel are of interest or which just make me incredibly happy, like so many things do in these chapters, especially Mr. and Mrs. Boffin. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin. So, Chapter 8, Mr. Boffin in Consultation. So what happens in Chapter 8 is broadly this. Mr. Boffin goes off to speak to Mortimer Lightwood, and while he is waiting for Mr. Lightwood, he meets a rather amusing young boy who is Mr. Lightwood's clerk. Mr. Boffin then meets Mr. Lightwood, and they discuss many things about the money that Mr. Boffin has come into, the Harmon fortune which is at the centre of Our Mutual Friend, and they discuss what is to be done with this fortune. And then, after that, Mr. Boffin is walking home and he runs into a man who has been following him the whole way, who is, of course, the mysterious Mr. Rokesmith, who offers his services to Mr. Boffin as a secretary. That is what happens in this chapter. So, things of interest. One thing in this chapter which I'm a great fan of is young Blight, who is Mr. Lightwood's clerk, who I find very, very entertaining. This young boy who goes through his diary reading out names which are obviously not really there because Mr. Lightwood doesn't have much business and doesn't have many clients. But we have this very entertaining boy who is described as dismal and seems quite as annoyed almost as Mr. Lightwood and Eugene are. There is this kind of pervading air of carelessness about the whole thing, and yet he does have this system which greatly entertains me. Young Blight made a great show of fetching from his desk a long thin manuscript volume with a brown paper cover and running his finger down the day's appointments, murmuring, Mr. Aggs, Mr. Baggs, Mr. Caggs, Mr. Daggs, Mr. Fags, Mr. Jaggs, Mr. Boffin. Yes, sir, quite right. You are a little before your time, sir. Mr. Lightwood will be in directly. It greatly entertains me. I find him very, very amusing. And one thing that I do love about Dickens, which I'm sure I have said before, is that even his minor characters are so eccentric and so entertaining and so odd. There is no one who doesn't have personality in Dickens. Being of a sensitive temperament, he was apt to consider it personally disgraceful to himself that his master had no clients. Another point of interest in this chapter is the juxtaposition between Mortimer Lightwood and Mr. Boffin. They are very, very different people, both in terms of their class and their education, but also in their temperament and their way they treat life. Mr. Boffin is so sincere, and Mr. Lightwood is so completely insincere, so careless, so disinterested in everything. So for example, there is this exchange between them which I really love and I think characterises a lot of what is at the heart of Our Mutual Friend. My dear Mr. Boffin, everything wears to rags, said Mortimer with a light laugh. I won't go so far as to say everything, returned Mr. Boffin, on whom his manner seemed to grate, because there's some things that I never found among the dust. And that, for me, really sums up the juxtaposition between their characters, in that Mortimer has despair in everything and doesn't really care about anything, whereas Mr. Boffin does have faith in some things, and even though he has seen a lot of hardship and he has seen a lot of trouble and he has watched his old master Harmon not be very nice to people, he still has a kind of faith in humanity and the world. And there are other incidences, such as when Mr. Boffin is talking to Mortimer about what Harmon was like as a master and about the way that Harmon treated his son, and he's talking in a great length in these long speeches about how Mrs. Boffin reacted to this and how they dealt as a couple with Harmon and the way that Harmon treated his children, and Mortimer replies in very short sentences in which there are lots of dashes and he's obviously just like muttering because he's not really listening, and the way that Dickens sets up that structure of their dialogue is really telling about how much Mr. Boffin cares about everything and how serious and sincere he is, and just how Mortimer doesn't really care. Another thing I love about this chapter is what it tells you about the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Boffin. Even though Mrs. Boffin doesn't feature in the chapter, Mr. Boffin talks about her a lot, and the way he talks about her and the affection but also the complete respect with which he discusses Mrs. Boffin and what she's like as a person is just lovely. I spoke in my discussion video for last month's chapters about how Mr. and Mrs. Boffin are one of the few couples in Dickens which seem happy, and it's really lovely to see the way they interact and the way that they treat one another. What I especially love in this chapter is how whenever Mr. Boffin is speaking to Mortimer Lightwood about the money that he has come into, even though technically and legally the property is his, not his wife's, he always says me and Mrs. Boffin and me. You know, when they discuss the reward of £10,000 that they want to put out for any information about the murder of young Mr. Harmon, he says, me and Mrs. Boffin have fixed the sum together and we stand to it. And then later he says, it shall be openly declared in the new notices that must now be put about in our names, in your name, Mr. Boffin, in your name. Very well, in my name, which is the same as Mrs. Boffin and means both of us. Mortimer Lightwood, being the legal voice, has to point out that actually, technically, the money is Mr. Boffin's, not Mr. and Mrs. Boffin's, but to Mr. Boffin, it's not his money, it's their money. And then, of course, we have the discussion between John Rokesmith and Mr. Boffin, when John Rokesmith follows him and slightly accosts him in the street and offers his services as a secretary. One thing I have been especially enjoying on the Goodreads group is listening to people's predictions about John Rokesmith and what they think his character is and what they think about him. I find it greatly entertaining. And he is rather a suspicious character. When Mr. Boffin asks him where he's from, he says, I have been in many places. And when Mr. Boffin asks him what he did, he says, I have been a student and a traveller. And it's all so ambiguous, isn't it? Another thing I have noticed, which I don't think I'd ever really noticed before reading Our Mutual Friend, is that we don't ever get a proper physical description of Mr. Rokesmith. We're told that he is of genteel appearance, but also that he appears repressed and awkward. And that's about all. We get very little physical details of him, which kind of adds to the mystery of him as a character. And next we have Mr. and Mrs. Boffin in consultation. So broadly what happens in this chapter is Mr. and Mrs. Boffin have a good old chat about what they want to do with their money. Now Mrs. Boffin has two instincts of what she wants to do with the money. One of them is she wants to be fashionable and she wants to go into society with a capital S. And the other thing she wants to do is to share her fortune and to help other people become as fortunate as them. And the two things that she suggests to Mr. Boffin that they do is one, to adopt an orphan and bring him up under John Harmon's name to fortune, and the other thing they want to do is look after Bella Wilfer. So in the last chapter we had the Boffins being brought together with Mr. Rokesmith, and in this chapter we have the Boffins being brought together with the Wilfers. After Mr. and Mrs. Boffin have had this conversation, they go to see a clergyman in order to try and go about finding an orphan that they could adopt, and after that they go on to see the Wilfers. Mrs. Wilfer is very stately, very cold, and not very keen on the Boffins, and no doubt feels rather jealous of them because she was hoping that her daughter would have lots of money, and also she's just not a very nice woman who doesn't like anybody. But Bella does not seem quite so unhappy with Mr. and Mrs. Boffin as her mother is, and she warms a little more to Mrs. Boffin. At the end of this chapter, as the Boffins are leaving the house, they run into John Rokesmith. Mr. Boffin refers to John Rokesmith as our mutual friend, the mutual friend of the Wilfers and the Boffins. So, things I think are of interest in this chapter. One, I think, is again the theme of respectability, which was so important in the last three chapters and is so important throughout the whole of this book. We have this idea of Mrs. Boffins, that now they have money, they have to live up to the money in some ways, they have to move in new circles, they have to leave their past behind. She says, when we worked like the neighbours, we suited one another. Now we have left work off. We have left off suiting one another. And when Mr. Boffin suggests that maybe the solution to this is that they start working again, because he doesn't really fancy society, his wife says no, out of the question. What they are going to have to do is go into society and live up to their money. And Dickens goes to great pains to present Mr. and Mrs. Boffin as unpolished, at times ignorant, but thoroughly and utterly good. And you see that again in the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Boffin and just how nice they are to each other, because to have a married couple that are nice to each other in Dickens is quite rare. There is a sense in these few chapters that Mr. and Mrs. Boffin have wanted a child and have been unable to have a child. And it's interesting to note in the conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Milvey and Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, where the Milveys ask if the Boffins have ever wanted children, what the Milveys say is in speech marks, is direct reported speech. And then what the Boffins reply is indirect speech, and it's not in speech marks. And for me that really symbolises the sadness of it, and the fact that this is a kind of constant answer, the idea that they have always wanted children and have not been able to have them. But now that they have the money, what Mr. and Mrs. Boffin set out to do is sort of build a surrogate family. And this is really interesting. I've mentioned this in a few other videos, I think, but one thing I find really fascinating in Dickens is how most of the happy families in Dickens are not like married parents and their children. They are surrogate families. They're families who are built of people who are not blood relations but come together and manage to form a family group. It's something that's really fascinating in Dickens, because although Dickens often claimed to be this great advocate of Victorian family domesticity, he really isn't when you read his books. In The Christmas Carol he is, but actually in his novels, the families that he presents are not those idealised nuclear families, the idea of which was so important in the Victorian period. They're something much more complicated, and I think this is really, really fascinating and something to always watch out for in Dickens' books. And after they have been to see the Milveys, they go and can see the Wilfers. And I find this meeting very entertaining and incredibly awkward. Again, we see such important issues of respectability and class built in here. When Lavinia, I think that's how you say her name, but I never know, when she lets them in, she says, "Our servant is out," because it's very important to let them know that she wouldn't normally answer the door. It's very important to let them know that they are respectable enough for that. And again, we have this very odd, stiff, formal conversation between Mrs. Wilfer and the Boffins, in which Mrs. Wilfer keeps referring to them in the third person and trying to be very, very stately, very, very respectable and ladylike. Likewise, the assumption that they are a family who are not respectable enough to recognise their reduced circumstances really grates on her very much. So when Mr. Boffin says, "Very pleasant premises," Mrs. Wilfer says, "Pardon me, sir, it is the abode of conscious though independent poverty." There is this idea of being respectable and independent, but also the fact that she is not so lower class to think that where she lives is acceptable in polite society. She is above where she lives, and she recognises that, and she's very sad about that. There is this very cold and awkward idea that she both feels she is very much above the Boffins, but also very much resents that they are now financially above her. However, although Mrs. Wilfer may not be very inclined towards the Boffins, Bella Wilfer does seem a little bit more inclined to her, and we have this moment where Mrs. Boffin just kisses Bella on the cheek because she is nice and she cares about her, and Bella can't help but be sort of moved to affection for Mrs. Boffin because it is such genuine kindness from Mrs. Boffin. And as much as Bella is selfish and self-absorbed and vain, she still can recognise kindness and is a slightly better person than her mother. And again, something else important to note about Bella, as much as her mother attempts to speak for her and does most of the talking in this conversation, we have this bit at the end of the conversation where Bella says, "I can speak for myself, you know, Ma. You needn't bring me in, please." There is this sense of her independence and her strong-headedness, but also her desire not to have other people speak her own opinion when she has her own opinions, something which is quite important about Bella, and I do rather like about her. And we have in this chapter the moment where we hear the title of the book, where Mr. Boffin describes Mr. Rokesmith as our mutual friend, which is really significant because when you read the title of Our Mutual Friend, it doesn't seem like a book that has a title character. Throughout the book, there are a lot of mutual friends. There are so many connections made between various characters, a lot of characters who know people who know other people that they didn't realise they know. But the title Mutual Friend, Our Mutual Friend, is John Rokesmith. It is important to note that Mr. Rokesmith, however mysterious he is, however much at this stage in the book we see nothing from his perspective, and he is always seen from quite a few steps back, he is the title character. He is the mutual friend. He is what ties so many different little aspects of the book together. And at the end of this chapter, we have more explained about the relationship between Bella and Mr. Rokesmith and how it has changed since he moved into this house and began lodging there. We have this very entertaining moment in which they're talking to each other, and Bella knows that he sort of fancies her, and he knows that she knows this, but they couldn't possibly say it because this is a Victorian polite society, and Bella isn't sure how she feels about him, but she's certainly intrigued by him, perhaps all the more because he admires her and she rather enjoys being admired. Yet he does describe himself as much interested in Bella in a way that seems quite forward for Victorian society and makes it quite awkward between them. Another thing that is of course of interest is that Mr. Rokesmith is an incredibly mysterious character. We know very little about him, but it's very easy for Bella to tell that he admires her. So the fact that he can repress and keep secret so much of his life and his personality but cannot quite keep that a secret is quite interesting. So, moving on to chapter 10. So chapter 10 of Our Mutual Friend is another society chapter. I know these are not everyone's favourites. They are quite a different writing style, I would say, from some of the other chapters. There's partly the present tense, but also Dickens's way of writing is much more flouncy and less down to earth. And I think he does that on purpose. There is effectiveness for Dickens, and for me reading, I think, of having the chapters about the Boffins, about these down-to-earth people, written in a much more down-to-earth way than the chapters about these people in society where everything is show and facade. So Dickens uses slightly different language to reflect these slightly different people. In this chapter, two characters get married. Mr. Tremlow gives the bride away in great confusion and not entirely knowing what he's doing there. Mortimer Lightwood is the best man in great disinterest and boredom, and Mr. and Mrs. Lamley get married. The wedding breakfast is held, and then we skip a fortnight later into the future where they are on their honeymoon walking along the beach, and they have both recently discovered that while they both thought the other was a gentleman or a lady of great property, actually neither of them have very much money or very much property at all. They have both married each other for worldly advantage, both to discover that actually neither of them can offer any advantage to the other, and they are now bound together for life. Oh dear. Like the previous society chapters we have had, for me the main purpose almost that this chapter serves, or the main purpose in terms of Dickens's social criticism, is to show the complete pretense of society, the fact that everything is a lie, even marriage is a lie, everyone's character is a lie, everyone's friendships is a lie, which again for me really ties into the novel's main theme of money and rubbish being very, very close to each other, and money and pretense and money and lies all being caught up. The idea that money is rotten. And there is this idea that within society, all that matters is money, or looking like you have money, the appearance of money. So in the beginning of this chapter, we have this discussion about shares, which I find very entertaining, and for me really sums up what I love about Dickens's writing style and how unique and entertaining it is. Have no established character, no cultivation, no ideas, no manner. Have shares. Have shares enough to be on boards of direction in capital letters, oscillate on mysterious business between London and Paris, and be great. Where does he come from? Shares. Where is he going to? Shares. What are his tastes? Shares. Has he any principles? Shares. What squeezes him into Parliament? Shares. Perhaps he never himself achieved success in anything, never originated anything, never produced anything. Sufficient answers to all? Shares. Oh mighty shares. It just sums up the importance of money within Victorian society and how money can buy you character, can buy you culture. I think that is really, really interesting and something that is so important to a lot of Dickens's novels, but especially Our Mutual Friend. And then of course we have the brilliant conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Lamley on the beach, in which they realise that they have both been deceived and that both of them were adventurers. And what is quite entertaining about this chapter is that both of them feel utterly and incredibly offended that they have been tricked into marrying someone with no money, but both of them have tricked the other person into marrying someone with no money, which is quite entertaining because although they clearly do not have a very happy marriage and have not started off very well, they're very, very similar and in many ways quite a good match in personality. And for all their great misery, they make a sort of pact at the end of the chapter that together they perhaps can go on scheming and finding more ways to make money because they are both adventurers. And again, in this pact between them and this understanding that the Lamleys come to and the way in which they plan to seek fortune, again sums up this idea throughout Our Mutual Friend of money coming from rubbish. What is going to come of this very unhappy, rotten pretense of a marriage? They're going to work together to try and make money out of it. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Lamley are quite an interesting couple and play quite an interesting role in the book. They're definitely worth keeping an eye out for, and one thing I think is very interesting to notice as the book goes on is the difference in betrayal between Mr. Lamley and Mrs. Lamley, because in many ways they are very, very similar, but their personalities are not exactly the same, and what Dickens does with this is quite interesting. I will talk about this much later on in other chapters, but I think it is worth keeping an eye out for as you're reading. So I think that is basically all I wanted to say for the chapters we have been reading in July. Please let me know down in the comments and on the Goodreads page what you have thought of these chapters and if you are enjoying the book as we go along. Next month we will be reading the next 3 chapters of the book. These are Podsnappery, a great name for a chapter, The Sweat of an Honest Man's Brow, and Tracking the Bird of Prey. So that's chapters 11, 12 and 13. I hope you are all enjoying Our Mutual Friend so far. As always, let me know what you thought of it down in the comments and I'll be back very soon with another video.